Hello, everybody. My name's Bruce Montgomery, and this is my colleague, Tracy Priest.
Hello, everybody.
That's where you say hello, Tracy. We're with The Road to Retail. On our podcast, Tracy and I hope to offer tips, insights, ideas, and examples for how small, emerging, or challenger brands can grow their business, where to start, how to get out of the farmer's market, how to prove it online, how to secure distribution at a national retailer, drive your business with the consumer, and when necessary, find an investor. The bottom line is we would love to help you be successful by highlighting the many important aspects of this journey to establishing and growing your brand. Tracy and I have made a lot of mistakes over the years, and we'd love to help you avoid those and accelerate your path to success. Tracy?
Awesome. Thanks, Bruce. So Bruce and I have been in consumer packaged goods commercial operations for 30 years. And what we mean by commercial operations is sales, marketing, trade marketing, acquisitions and divestitures, product development, distributor and broker management, just to name a few. And on our podcast, as Bruce said, our passion is to really help small emerging brands navigate the journey to retail. Also on our episodes, we invite friends and colleagues from the industry to come and share their experiences with our audience as well. And today we've got a fantastic guest. I'd like to introduce to you Rob Maxwell. And today on our podcast, we're going to talk about how to hire a broker and the ins and outs of that process. So Rob, welcome to Road to Retail. And Rob, just give us a brief background. You've just got an awesome variety of experiences. So share with our audience today just a little bit about you.
Thanks, Tracy. Appreciate it. And appreciate both of you for having me today. Really my pleasure to be here. So my food background started back in 1992 at a place called Bread and Circus. And Bread and Circus was a family-owned chain based out of Boston, owned by the Harnett family. And right around the time that I started, it was acquired by Whole Foods in kind of hitting the main stride of Whole Foods growth through acquisition phase. So kind of a serendipitous moment. But I spent the next 24 years with Whole Foods Market, doing everything from running departments all the way up through executive coordinator of operations for the South region. So we're in about 2016, the whispers of maybe an acquisition started happening, and I had kind of a moment where I decided I wanted to do something a little bit smaller and get back to my roots in the natural foods industry, and went to a brand called Grandy Oats, which is an organic producer based in Maine, run a solar powered bakery out in Western Maine, and they do organic trail mixes, roasted nuts and seeds, and granolas. So spent 3 years with the owners there working on scaling the business up. Had a great time. It's an amazing group of people. And when that work was finished, the owners were still very active. So I moved on from Grandy Oats to Rodeo CPG, which was really just getting ramped up there. I think there were 7 of us when I started there, and I think Rodeo today is probably about 40. So spent 3 years at Rodeo working on the services model over there. Had an incredible 3 years with that crew, great people. And currently serving as the Senior Vice President of Growth Services at Dirty Hands. So got a very rounded kind of knowledge base. Worked on the brand side, have worked on the services side, and have worked on the retailer side. So I like to think that gives me interesting perspective on lots of things in our industry.
It definitely does, Rob.
Yeah, without question. So Rob, before we jump off, as Tracy said, today's topic is kind of how to hire and work with a broker successfully. So before we get into those details, just to make sure we level set, can you tell the folks out there, what a broker does and the role they play for a brand?
Yeah, I think in the best case scenario, a broker is really, for an early stage brand anyway, a guide and a partner. It's a partner that ideally is helping you carve a path to a healthy sales model. Is doing some mapping for you, giving you some financial expectations of what you should expect, so you can do some cash planning. Ideally, they're able to help you establish some distribution out of the gate. We should probably put an asterisk on that and come back to that. That's gotten a little complicated these days. But in a perfect scenario, I think really a broker is a sales partner that is helping the brand to carve a path into distribution and into retail that's sustainable, and that has clear expectations of what success looks like. And I think that's probably like a 30,000 foot. I think what a really good broker partner can do for you at the beginning.
Nice. I like the reference to partner and a guide and cash planning. We'll come back to that as well as distribution, because a lot of times people's speed of running can outrun their cash, and that is not good. Tracy?
Yeah. So, Rob, tell us a little bit about how does a small emerging brand know that they're ready for a broker? So as a lot of our audience, they may be selling at the local farmers market, or they may be in a few, regional small retailers, in their region. So tell us a little bit about what's the mental checklist that a brand should go through to determine whether they're really ready to hire a broker sales force?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, really one of the key components comes back to, I guess there's a few pieces. So first one being proof of concept. Are you having success in the local market? Are you getting reorders? Is the product moving at a reasonable clip? Is your feedback solid? Is your pricing competitive as far as at the stage that you're at? And then the other piece, I think, is expansion is expensive. So, some of it's a cash game. Are you funded to a point where you have either self or through somebody else? Do you have the funding to support some growth? Because growth is cash out first before it's cash in. So, I think that's an important piece for all brands to really consider, is that cash component of it might be 3 months before you see, it might be longer in certain cases before you actually see any of that money come back, but that inventory is going out, and that inventory is just your cash until it's transitioned into income. I think those are a couple of the keys. General appetite for growth and what that looks like. Are you looking to do something in a very regional play? Are you thinking bigger? If you're thinking bigger, you might have a different strategy that you want to enact for something like that. But again, it really does come back to preparedness, I think.
I agree. And I think the other thing I would think is important is, and we talk a lot about this with our retail partners, is supply chain. Is your supply chain solid? Have you ever shipped to a retailer before? So a lot of times small emerging brands, they're selling it at the local farmers market or a couple regional accounts or a regional distributor, which is easy to do, but then they want to get into a much larger retailer, which, as you said, is very expensive to do, but you've also got to have the supply chain ready to take that on. Would you agree with that?
Such an important component. You're so right. I think especially in this modern time that we're in right now, where manufacturing is challenged for sure. I think everybody's feeling that. Line time is down. I think the co-manufacturers are largely leveraging into their big partners because that's their safety net, and they have to service those first. So as a smaller brand, much harder now to get a co-manufacturer on board at a minimum order quantity, or MOQ, that is reasonable. We're seeing a lot of brands being challenged with a very high MOQ, which really is a pretty significant risk. If you can't feasibly move that product, you're gonna end up losing it. So I think there's a lot to be said there, Tracy. I totally agree with that point. I think you couldn't be more right.
When you deal with a broker, Rob, and you're talking to, let's say, your first retailer, and just to keep the hypothetical, let's say it's a regional brand out in New England somewhere, and you get a food account that wants to put you in, and they're interested, and the question comes down: do you do a 50 store test, or do you go chain wide? How do you, as the entrepreneur, work with the broker? I've worked with a lot of brokers, and I would say almost all of them have your best interest in heart. But every now and then, they're capitalists, and they're like, hey, 200's bigger than 50. And then you run into cash crunch, maybe supply chain. But how do you coach an emerging brand to be like, hey, let's be a little patient, make sure we've got our act together? How do you have that conversation?
Yeah, I think it really does come back to, I mean, it's kind of iterative steps of proof of concept to me. So, like you kind of want to test at different scales as you're able. At the same time, it's hard to say no to an opportunity. I totally appreciate that, having been on the brand side. I get it. It's very exciting to get a big hit. But it really, you have to consider, and this is part of what I would talk to a brand about, is you really have to consider what can you support, not just financially, but mentally. Like what is your team prepared to support? Like if you're moving into larger geographies, it becomes a lot more challenging. You're looking at, you're not going to have eyes on every store anymore if you go into a massive geography. So it's a little bit of a leap of faith. So without a stronger proof of concept, my personal opinion would be, take it in steps, take it in strides, get some learnings through that process while you have the opportunity to see different actions at different scales, I guess, for lack of a better way to say it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Hey, Tracy, one other question here, Rob, while we're on this. And this will dovetail into our next more juicy question. When you're dealing with people that claim to be brokers, can you talk a little bit about the person, and let's just say it's me, who has a couple of good contacts, but might not have the back office to support the real activities? The contact's obviously key, because if you can't get a meeting, you can't get distribution, but there's so much more that has to be done.
That back office piece is huge. And, I've told this story to a few different folks, but, there have been times where I've had a small regional broker in place who, in total honesty, maybe I wasn't blown away by their sales performance. They were okay. But the back office was so strong that the value prop actually stood out. It's that big a deal. So I think the point you're making is huge. And I think it's a matter of, do you have that competency in-house? And the answer at early stages is almost always no. It's a complicated space. Distributor paperwork is not simple. Understanding how promos flow is not simple. All the forms and submissions are different at every retailer. So having that institutional knowledge to kind of support that really goes an awful long way in insulating you into some really nice success stories. The flip side is, a person that has, let's say somebody's got this great, connection at retailer X, and they can help crack that door open. I think there can be value there, but I think as long as your eyes are open to what's on the table, what should you expect? What's this person delivering? Because if they're just delivering an approval at a meeting, then the work starts, right? It's like closing that deal is significant, and it's certainly an impactful moment, but making that deal successful goes beyond the close of that deal, right? There's a lot more to it to make that a good thing for both you and your retail partner. Because I think it's another thing early stage brands kind of forget sometimes, is I think it's not uncommon to talk to folks that kind of have a misunderstanding of the relationship with the retailer, that the retailer is responsible for selling your stuff. They're not really. They're responsible for putting your stuff on the shelf. Right. The selling of the stuff is really a brand driven event. It's really not a retailer driven event. So I think getting to a place of understanding of that is so important for brands too, of what are you doing past getting it to the retailer's shelf, because there's more to the story, because none of us are winning until that thing comes off the shelf, right? That's the win at the end of the day. So kind of having that full sight line and that full focus as to what does success actually look like, I just think that's so important. And I still do see sometimes folks that don't understand that flow quite yet.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because Tracy and I did a series of interviews, Rob, with about 12 buyers from large retailers. And one of the great quotes was this buyer said, "I've literally seen brands like start high-fiving and hugging when I tell them we're going to take them. And I have to caution them and say, hey, the work starts now."
Right.
Tracy?
So
yeah. And I want to piggyback on two things that Rob said. First of all, Rob, one of our bumper stickers at Road to Retail is, it's not about sell in, it's about sell through. So you just said that exactly. And I think also when you get into bigger retailers, Rob, that back office becomes even so much more important, like a Target, a CVS, a Walmart. They have their own systems, they have their own language, they have multiple portals. And if you're not with a broker that knows how to do all that back office stuff, you are going to, fail mightily. I had an experience where one brand took almost a year to get set up at Target.
Oh, I don't think that's uncommon. Yeah, it's a complex process, especially at the large chains that you're referencing. You're right. I mean, they're very complex systems that are not easily learned. They're not inherently user friendly. Again, like I keep saying this, but there's an institutional knowledge to certain things. That large chain function is really one of them, and I wouldn't honestly even dare trying to tackle one of those large chains without a broker partner in place. I personally wouldn't.
Perfect. That's exactly what I thought as well. So next question is, so tell our audience the difference between a broker and a distributor. We've gotten this a couple times from our audience. So just tell us a little bit. I think it's pretty obvious, but we wanted to make sure that we put that out there, because sometimes people get confused.
Yeah, I have an interesting take on this. I think when I was with Whole Foods, I spent 2 or 3 years in London working on the UK expansion project, and it was interesting because the industry in the UK, the distributor functionally is the broker. I mean, they really are doing a lot of active selling, and that was interesting to me because it's not quite that here. While there's exceptions and there's some caveats to that statement. So one of the caveats would be distributors have sales teams for sure, right?
Right.
But distributors are also carrying a blinding level of brands. I mean, it's a lot of products. So it's not realistic to assume that a US-based distributor is really going to be highly successful for you, especially as an early stage brand in that sales function. Are there things that they can do? Will they occasionally produce wins? Sure, it can happen. Absolutely. But is that something that you want to build your plan on? I would say definitely not.
Right.
So unless you're really in like a DSD or direct store delivery environment, which again is a little bit of a different animal, but I think for typical center store grocery items here, the distributor, to answer the question succinctly and as simply as I can, the distributor is your partner that gets the product from where you manufacture it, or you bring it to them, whichever, and then gets the product from the distributor's warehouse to the retailers. That's really the function of your distribution partner. And that's, if I'm being frank, I think that's the expectation that I would put on my distributor partner, is that's kind of it. That's what I'm looking for there. There are some other components, but probably less significant. A broker is responsible for creating the opportunities for you to sell your product into retailers, right? So looking for appointments, presenting for you if you don't want to do it for yourself. I would always recommend being a part of that if you're a brand. I think, push to go to all of the presentation meetings that you possibly can. I think that's a good practice. It's a good learning experience, and you're going to sell your product better than anybody else will ever sell your product.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yep, for sure.
But I think those are the fundamental, basic differences between the two. And those are how I would place those expectations on those two partners.
So I want to clarify something, because I know some of the brands that I've had experience with, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm going to say this statement. A distributor is not responsible for sell-through of your brand or building your brand. Like you said, I think they are a logistics partner. And I think that sometimes the distributor portrays themselves as, that's my role, is to promote and to sell and to help you with sell-through. You want to?
I would agree. I would agree. Yeah, I would totally agree with that statement. And like I said, there's always exceptions to rules, but I think that's a healthy rule to live by. There are probably a couple of exceptions out there, but I wouldn't put stock in distributors as your sales partner. That's not something that I would probably put bets on being a good strategy.
Yeah, exactly.
So Rob, there's all kinds of levels of complexity as a brand or a company get bigger, but when you're a small emerging challenger brand, can you kind of speak in broad terms, like what does a compensation plan look like? The length of a contract, is it fixed fee and then converts to a commission structure? Can you just give the group here a little bit of an idea of what to expect when they have that first kind of terms phone call or meeting?
Sure. I mean, and I think you're going to see there's be some variance between different partnerships, right? But I think by and large, things that are not uncommon. If you do not have any established sales, if you're going in expecting to go a commission only deal, that you might be disappointed. For the broker, there's nothing in it for them to do that. So while your brand, I'm sure, is amazing and absolutely, I'm sure has all of the potential in the world, brokers still have to pay their salespeople. I mean, they still have people out there selling, doing the work, and those people have to get a paycheck. So they can't do that on a percentage, which, you know, at the starting point is nothing. So a modest retainer, I think, is pretty standard. And a conversion piece, as you mentioned, may look like, you know, anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 or anywhere in there as a retainer, and then converting to 5% or something like that as you crest that 1,000 or 3,000. So it's, you know, not uncommon to see X or 5%, whichever is greater. I think that's a pretty standard. It's a pretty standard thing that I think you'd see out there. There's also different models. I mean, you've got, you know, outsourced VP of sales level folks that, you know, are going to be a much higher retainer, playing a more strategic role. I don't know if that's the place to start. Probably not where I would start. It's kind of an expensive place to launch from, but it can certainly work. So, you know, sometimes those folks maybe have different connections that are able to open distribution faster. But I think those are traditionally kind of the two functions that I would see, with the only other exception being a retailer specific broker, which usually I think you'd still see some version of one of those things, right, where it's a modest retainer and or a percent as compensation.
Yeah, that was kind of my follow-up question. Was there's I don't want to say the word cottage because a lot of them are very sophisticated, but a bit of a cottage industry around the largest retailers. It's like, hey, all I do is Kroger or Whole Foods or Dollar General or CVS. Do you have any thoughts on the true specialist? I mean, my view, and I've hired a bunch of them, is when I'm struggling or I have to win somewhere, I will go to that Target, Whole Foods, that person where it's like, hey man, this is all we do. I'm like, okay, I don't need an entire East Coast broker. I have to figure out why I'm suffering at X.
Yeah, I've used quite a few of them, and in you know, fortunately in a bunch of cases to great effect. So I won't speak poorly of those groups. I mean, I'm sure there's good and bad everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. So there is that, but I've certainly seen Target specifically, without mentioning names. There's a broker group that I've used successfully numerous times, and I think they just do a fantastic job. They know that account like the back of their hand. They have the relationships, and it's always been a good experience. And I've seen that with Walmart, certainly seen that with Kroger. You know, larger banners, usually that's not an unusual way to focus. It's not, you don't have to. I mean, we've seen success there without those as well, right? But in the, you know, I think, Bruce, in the example you're setting where it's like, I have to win here, like this one, I have to get this, then I think that can be a good approach to get a hyper specialist on that account and see what you can do. Because to some degree, and this is one of the harder parts of our industry, right, is if a broker's not performing, or even a hyper specialist broker is not performing, and by not performing, I mean, it's just not getting in. The buyers just aren't taking it in.
Right.
It's sometimes it may be that the broker isn't performing correctly, but a lot of times it's also that the product isn't resonating, right? And that's some hard feedback to take. So I think it's important for your broker partners, for you to build a relationship with your broker partners where honesty and the ability to give and take feedback in both directions is an integral piece of that relationship, because you want to know what the objections are. I mean, you really want to know what the objections are. So if you can't hear that, and you're not collecting that information or soliciting that information from your brokers, or that information is hard to get, like if you're hearing that, like, they didn't take it, okay, why? Is it packaging? Is it price? Is it competition? I mean, what flavor, like what's going on? Give me the feedback, because as an entrepreneur, you've got to work with that feedback, because once you start hearing some consistent threads, then that's something you've got to really do something about.
Right.
You know,
Well,
one negative reaction is whatever, but when you start hearing consistency, that's something different.
well, and like you were saying, that's why you've got to be at these meetings. You can't just like sit back at your office or your house and then wait for the phone call to hear how it goes. Because something will get lost in translation, and not maliciously. You want to hear that it's the packaging or you're $1 too high. So 2 other nuts and bolts questions, and then we'll move on. So for a person that's never hired a broker before, Rob, what kind of a suggestion do you make in terms of accepting an initial duration of length? Because a lot of entrepreneurs will say, hey, I want to save some money on legal. Why don't you, Bruce, the broker, send me your contract? Should it be annual renewable? Should the first one be 6 months? And yeah, there's always outs and stuff, but even those get complicated if you've never done it before.
Yeah, it's a good point. I'm a fan. I think there's a happy medium here between what works for the brand and what works for the broker. I think the reality for a lot of brands, and this is another tough one I think for early stage brands to swallow, is getting it going takes a minute. It's not fast.
Right.
Like you hire a broker, it does not mean you're launching in all these accounts tomorrow. That's not how it works. I mean, you've got to get past just getting somebody bought in so you can set up distribution. Like that in itself is a serious mountain climb. So in so much as like, what does a contract look like? I wouldn't balk at 4 to 6 months. I wouldn't probably sign on for a year out of the gate personally. Not saying you couldn't and shouldn't, but like for me, I'd want to keep it a little tighter. I'd want to make sure that we're on the right trajectory, because the onboarding is a lot of work for everybody. There's a lot there. So I think 4 to 6 months is a reasonable time frame to kind of get a feeling for, are we heading in a good direction? Are we presenting the products? What's the feedback? How are we doing getting distribution up? Like what are we, you should have a pretty good idea of what's going on in that time frame. So that window works for me. A lot of brokers will ask for a year, and I don't blame them for that. Honestly, I think that's not an unreasonable ask. To your point, I think if you're going to sign a longer contract, you want to make sure that there are some out clauses that are clear and that you understand what it means, and that there are metrics in place that you can actually go to those and say, this relationship doesn't seem to be working as we'd hoped. And, in the contract, we have this clause. So we'd like to push that forward and say, we're going to exit in 30, 60, 90 days, whatever that clause is. I do think you want to be mindful of what you're signing for sure.
Right.
Read it. It's not fun to read, but you should read it.
I wanted to highlight one thing you said is it's not an immediate process. So I get this question all the time from small emerging brands. So how long is it going to take to get on the shelf? Well, that depends on, maybe you can answer that question. My answer is it depends on the retailer, but what's your thought when a small emerging brand comes to you and says, okay, I want to hire you, but when am I going to get on the shelves at Whole Foods, as an example?
Yeah, and I would probably answer similarly in that, that's not necessarily a decision that we make, and in fact is not a decision that we make, because as the broker, assuming, let's say we're the broker, we'd like for that to happen tomorrow. That would be really good for us. That'd be good for all of us. That's like nobody wants to lose.
Right.
Everybody wants to win here. So
Right.
So there's mutual alignment of goal. But I think you're right. I think understanding what the category review timing is, if you're fixated on Whole Foods, let's say, right? If that's like, I have to get into Whole Foods, that's why I'm hiring this person. But your category review isn't for another 9 months. Exactly. That might not be the right time to hire somebody. You might want to pause and learn about when your review is. Now, there's alternatives, right? You might be able to do an off cycle through a local program or something like that. So it really just depends on goals, and your willingness to be flexible and how are we going to approach this thing. But yes, I think really retailer driven, to some degree distributor driven these days. I mean, distributors are challenged right now. It's, the supply chains are tough, and the big houses are definitely seeing some challenges in keeping up with everything. So, that can slow things down a little bit, I think, right now.
For sure.
So Rob, if an emerging brand has kind of done the mental checklist and they think that their supply chain's in order and they've got some money in the bank and they sort of know that, hey, we're from New England, we're going to start in New England and not Phoenix, but they don't know anybody. How do they meet a broker or find out like who's the daddy of getting into XYZ retailer? How do you manage that minefield?
Yeah, I mean, and it really depends, right? I think there's a few answers to that. I mean, there's obviously, the nice thing about specifically a natural channel about our industry is it's a pretty supportive industry, right? I mean, it's a pretty open industry. People are generally happy to give advice. People want to share their experiences. So really using that network, getting involved in any of the active groups, or getting a subscription to like, any of the publications and kind of tracking, you'll see activity from a lot of different folks there. So that can be a very, cheap and easy way to kind of get involved in the community. But in other spaces, and I'll use, so I'm in Maine, and I'll use, a specific reference here. Here they have a program, called MCE. And it really is built to help founders kind of connect and learn, and it's an educational piece so that people don't kind of go blind. I think there's a lot more of that happening in a lot of states. So really looking there too. I think this one is actually it's a philanthropic funded group, but I think there's state funded groups. I know Colorado has a state funded group. So I think there's a lot of different opportunities to find. I think it's just a matter. You just have to look around.
Yeah. Network.
All day, every day. Yep, and it never stops.
So,
Tracy?
So Rob, tell us a success story of where you've seen a small emerging brand hire a broker, and it's been a great experience for both parties and been a success, and they've both won and shared in those winnings.
Yeah, I mean, I'll use a personal story. When I was at Grandy Oats, we had really focused to that time. We'd kind of focused on I would say UNFI East, right? For lack of a better way to say it. And primarily in the Northeast, because it's a Maine-based brand. So it has a good local following. It was, very successful in the region. But, we had aspirations past that. So Aaron, the owner, and I, we kind of put our heads together, and we decided we really thought the products would really resonate in California. We kind of had this like bi-coastal plan of, this is kind of East Coast and the West Coast, we feel like is where this product's really going to resonate. And, we used our network and rolled the dice a little bit. We actually talked to a buyer that we were friendly with at Whole Foods at the time. This goes back a little ways. And we said, who's out in your area that is, reputable and that you've enjoyed working with? And he gave us a list of folks that he thought he'd had good interactions with. And we interviewed them all. We went with one, and it was really a kind of a boutique California-based brokerage. They're still in business, and they crushed it. I mean, they absolutely crushed it for us. We blew up California in 3 years. We doubled the sales of the company. I mean, it was incredible. So that was beyond successful. Now we were selling as well, so I'm not going to say it was it was just the broker partner, but that was a true partnership, and it was a really good relationship. It was very positive, and they really understood our product. They took the time to train their entire team on the product. We had a lot of opportunities to connect with their team, and it was really a transformative moment for the business. I mean, it was an incredible thing. We were able to beef up our production facility, and it was pretty incredible. So that's just a personal story. I've certainly seen it numerous times with others, but it's really when you can build that true partnership, right? It's like I think a lot of times what happens is and you two have seen this, I'm sure, but brands will kind of take this like needing to be extremely aggressive and dominant towards their brokers, and it's seldom a winning combination. I mean, It's not like if you are rough to your brokers. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying don't hold them accountable. You should, right? But holding them accountable is a math game. That's not a verbal game, right? That's numbers. But I think that, I think when brands kind of take that tone, you have to think of the human psychology involved and look at, okay, that tone is trickling to all of the people in the field that are tasked with selling your product. They don't like you. That's not good.
Right.
You can't win, so it's like, you have to ride this fine line of really pushing. And, there's a level of being a squeaky wheel that they think is really important in your broker partnership. You don't want to be forgotten. You don't want to be not communicative. You want to be very involved. However, you don't want them to dislike you. because they're not going to do you're not going to do your best work for somebody that's not nice to you. It's just not, that's not human psychology.
Sure.
It just doesn't work like that.
Right.
So I think that's, meandering a little bit off the question, but I do think that's an important piece, when considering these relationships,
Yeah.
Actually, Rob, I think you might have just also answered my follow-up, because I was going to say, let's look at the other side of that coin. What are actions or examples that smaller brands may have made that proved ineffective or damaging when working with a broker? And you just talked about basic kind of human courtesy, right? Hopefully stuff you learned at your breakfast table growing up, but I don't know if you want to go a little bit deeper there, because relationships matter, right? And if every time my name lights up on your phone, you're like, oh my God, it's just not going to bode well.
It's so true. I mean, it's so true. I think, yeah, I think if you've ended up as a brand, if you're at the point where you're that angry at your broker, you need a new broker, or you need a not broker. Like you have the wrong partnership. Like this isn't working, right? And I think at this stage, I think brokers, are firing brands in certain circumstances for just like, this is not a tenable working relationship. This isn't,
Right.
we want to rep
both
your
ways.
Yeah. It's like, a little bit of decency and a little bit of respect in both directions. And I think it very, very much does have to go in both directions. I'm not saying brokers are busy people, right? It's a busy business. It's a hustle. It's a lot of work. So, putting yourself in somebody's shoes, it's like, you do have, like I said, you do have to stay involved, because as soon as you go quiet, they're never in a space where they don't have things that have to happen. I mean, there's always a million things that they have to do. So I like I said, I think it's important to stay in tune with the team, and I think it's important to be participatory, and it's important to provide the information that they need. And this is kind of the working relationship piece, a little bit more on the technical side. We talked about how do you know you're ready to go work with a broker? Well, there's a couple of I think almost ops or finance pieces that really matter here, and one of them is, do you have a spec sheet that's recognizable in the general consensus of the industry? Because you need one if you don't.
Right.
That's a must-have. Do you have a price list? Because you can't reasonably expect your brokers to sell things without a price list. It's not going to go well. You're going to end up in a weird cash place. It's going to get real uncomfortable, or they're not going to be able to execute on anything.
Right.
Do you have packaging images? Do you have packaging flats? There's just some basic components that I think you have to be ready to provide. And as things change, if you've engaged outsourced partners, you have to feed them that information in as real time as you possibly can, because it's critical information. So as they're setting up paperwork, if they're filling out something wrong, it can take, to do a price change, it takes at least 3 months now with the big distributors. So I think understanding that flow and having the competency of like what a broker needs to work for you, right? There's things that they need. It's not just like you sign a contract and all of a sudden sales happen. It's like, no, I need, a sales deck. I need sell sheets. I need, like I said, the spec sheet, the price list, and some of those basic components I just think are absolutely mandatory that you have that sorted out before you try to sign on with a broker.
That's great. That's great insight, Rob. Great insight.
So
Bruce?
one final question here, Rob, from me in terms of what you just said. So as an entrepreneur or small brand, and maybe you've been doing everything, and maybe you have one right-hand person, and now you're going to go the broker route, and you've met someone you, at least right now, you trust, and you have a spec sheet. What's that, and it comes back to respect, what you were saying, but what's that moment of introspection where the entrepreneur needs to say, I need to take a little bit of a step back. Yes, hold them accountable. Yes, squeak a little bit, but I'm hiring these people because they do X, Y, and Z better than me. So what's that, the introspection where that entrepreneur, where you might say, hey, Bruce, if you want to hire me and I'm your broker, these are the 3 things I'm going to be point man on. I want your input, but come on, man. If you don't trust us to do that, why are we even talking? So what do you think the entrepreneur needs to yield to the broker to enhance their potential for success?
I think if you're going to hire a broker on, you've got to trust their process. And I think that's the most succinct way that I can say it. Like, there's a process to this, right? And for brokers especially, there's kind of like a cadence and a dance to this industry. There's, they presumably know the category review timelines. They know the temperaments of the buyers. They know. So, an example: if I'm going to somebody as my broker, and I say, hey, I want you to call so and so at Wegmans. I have their number. Just call them and tell them to get me in, right? And your partner is saying, okay, I can't do that because, one, that potentially damages my relationship with that buyer, and I have a lot of brands to consider here. I can't just annoy a buyer on your behalf. So, I guess a short way of saying it, Bruce, would be the reckless tenacity that you might be able to afford, right, as an entrepreneur. Your broker partner can't. They can't do reckless. That won't work, because there's a balance to these relationships, and there's a reason that these buyers give them time, because they're presenting things in a way that are easily digestible to them. They're being respectful of their time. They're kind of respecting kind of like a set of rules that can be specific to each buyer, and really working within that cadence to keep that relationship good. So sometimes that hard push is really where you're going to meet that kind of defiant response. Sometimes it's a soft approach and getting in there and getting in at the right time, in the right way, with the paperwork filled out exactly correctly, going back to the importance of the back office. There's a lot of components there. So I think letting go of the need to control how the relationship with the retailer is handled. You have to let that go. That's no longer yours. That's gone. And a broker, if you're pushing them on that, and they say yes, they're just yesing you. They're not going to do what you're saying, because they can't. Right. It won't make any sense.
Well, Rob, that was a great term. With the guitar on your wall, I think reckless tenacity is the name of your next band.
I like it. I like it.
All right, Tracy.
Awesome. So, Rob, if somebody listening to our podcast wants to reach out to you, how do they get a hold of you?
Yeah, you can hit me on email at robm@dhstoresupport.com, or by all means, hit me up on LinkedIn, Robert S. Maxwell.
Awesome. Rob, great time together. Very insightful, as I thought. Thanks for sharing with our audience today. And so the big finish is, if you want to follow us, you can follow us on LinkedIn at Road to Retail, or on our YouTube channel, Road to Retail. And we're excited also to announce that we're now on Spotify, also on Road to Retail. So multiple platforms to reach out to our content. And again, thanks, Rob, for joining us, and look forward to posting this episode in a couple weeks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rob. This was great. Good luck out there, everybody.
Yep.